Book 5, 54 B.C. The Second Invasion of Britain. In the consulship of Lucius Domitius and Appius Claudius, before setting out from winter quarters to Italy, as I did every year, I instructed the generals whom I had left in command of the legions to have the old fleet repaired, and to arrange for the building of as many new ships as possible during the winter. I told them exactly how I wanted these new ships to be built. So that they could be loaded quickly and beached easily, I had them made with a rather lower freeboard than is usual in the Mediterranean. This seemed safe enough, since I had noticed that in the Channel, owing to the frequent ebb and flow of the tides, the waves are comparatively small, so that they could carry a large cargo, which would include numerous animals. I had the ships made rather broader than those we normally use in other waters. They were all to be fitted with sails and oars, and this was made all the easier because of their low freeboard. Materials for equipping the ships were to be brought from Spain. I myself, as soon as I had finished dealing with the assizes in northern Italy, set out for Illyria, since I had heard that the Perusti were making raids on that part of the province which was nearest to them, and were doing much damage. When I arrived, I ordered the local communities to raise troops and told them where to assemble. As soon as the Perusti heard of this, they sent a deputation to me to explain that their government had had nothing whatever to do with these raids. They were ready, they said, to make every possible kind of reparation for the damage that had been done. I accepted this statement of theirs, and ordered them to give me hostages who were to be delivered on a date which I named. And I told them that if they failed to do this, I should make war on them. The hostages were brought as ordered on the right day, and I appointed arbitrators to assess the damage that each community had sustained, and to fix the amount of reparations due. After dealing with this matter, I held the assizes in Illyria, and then returned to northern Italy. From here I set out to rejoin the army. On arriving in Gaul, I made a tour of inspection of all the winter camps. I found that, in spite of a very great shortage of materials, the men had worked magnificently. They had built about 600 ships of the type described above, and 28 warships. These would all be ready for launching in a few days. I congratulated the men and the officers who had been in charge of this operation, told them what I wanted done next, and ordered the whole fleet to assemble at Boulogne. I had discovered that from this port one can make the easiest crossing to Britain, the distance being about 28 miles from the continent. I left sufficient troops for carrying out this task, and set out myself for the country of the Treveri, with 4 legions, marching light, and 800 cavalry. I took this action because the Treveri had failed to attend the Gallic councils, had neglected my orders, and were believed to be making overtures to the Germans across the Rhine. The Treveri have much the most powerful cavalry in Gaul, and also a large army of infantry. I have already mentioned that this country borders on the Rhine. At this time 2 of their chiefs, Indutiomarus and Cingetorix, were struggling for supreme power in the state. As soon as it was known that I was approaching with an army, Cingetorix came to me. He assured me that he and all his followers would loyally abide by their alliance with Rome, and told me what the situation was among the Treveri. Indutiomarus, on the other hand, began to prepare for war. He assembled forces of cavalry and infantry, and hid all those who were too old or too young for military service in the huge forest of the Ardennes, which stretches right across the country of the Treveri, from the Rhine to the frontier of the Remi. However, several chiefs of the tribe, partly because they were friends of Cingetorix, partly because they were overawed by the presence of our army, came to me, and began to beg my support in various private interests of their own, it being impossible for them, so they said, to speak openly in the public interest. Indutiomarus now feared that he would be deserted by everyone, and sent a deputation to me himself. He claimed that the reason he had been unwilling to leave his own people and come to see me was that he could best keep the tribe loyal by staying with them, If all the nobility had left, he feared that the common people would, in their ignorance, have made some serious mistake. As it was, he said, he had everything under control, and with my permission he proposed to visit me, and put both himself and his tribe under my protection. I realized well enough the purpose of this speech, and also the real reason why Indutiomarus was afraid to go on with his original plan. However, now that everything was ready for the campaign in Britain, I did not want to have to waste the summer among the Treveri. I therefore ordered Indutiomarus to bring 200 hostages with him when he came. The hostages were duly delivered, among them his son and all his family, whom I had asked for especially. I assured Indutiomarus that they would come to no harm, and urged him to remain loyal to us. At the same time, however, I had private interviews with the other chiefs of the Treveri, and won them over to the side of Cingetorix. I was conscious that Cingetorix deserved to be helped by me in this way, and I also thought it very important that one who had given such remarkable evidence of his loyalty to me should be as strong as possible among his own people. Indutiomarus, however, was bitterly offended by my action. He realized that he was losing prestige in the tribe, and the resentment he felt about this made him hate us even more than he had before. When this business had been settled, I marched with the legions to Bologna. I was informed there that 60 ships, which had been built in the country of the Meldi, had been driven off their course by a storm, and compelled to return to their starting point. But I found all the rest fully equipped and ready for sailing. 4,000 cavalry from all parts of Gaul, and the chieftains of the various tribes had also assembled at Bologna. I had decided to leave behind only a few chieftains of proved loyalty to myself, and to take the rest with me by way of hostages, since I feared that otherwise there might be a rising in Gaul during my absence. Among these chieftains was Domnarix the Aeduan, who had already been mentioned in this narrative. He was one of those whom I was particularly anxious to have with me, since I knew that he aimed at winning power for himself by revolutionary means, and also that he was a courageous man with great influence among his countrymen. I discovered from some Gauls with whom I had stayed that he told the council of the Aedui that I was going to offer him the position of king of the tribe, a statement which the Aedui very much resented, though they did not dare to send a deputation to me to protest against my alleged decision, or ask me to give it up. Now Domnarix began to put forward every possible reason for asking to be left behind in Gaul. He was unused to sailing, he said, and was frightened of the sea. Next, there were religious reasons which prevented him from going. He soon saw, however, that I was determined not to let him have his own way, and when he realized that there was no hope of getting what he wanted, he began to make approaches to the other Gallic chieftains, talking with them privately, and trying to persuade them to stay on the continent. He played on their fears by suggesting that I had an object of my own in thus stripping Gaul of all her nobility. My plan was, he said, to bring across into Britain, and there put to death all those whom I did not dare treat in this way in the sight of their own countrymen. He pledged his own word to the rest, and asked from them a guarantee in return that they would all work together for what they conceived to be the interests of Gaul. I received reports of these intrigues from several people, and when I saw what the situation was, I decided that, in view of the particular consideration which I had always shown for the Aedui, I ought to do everything I possibly could to keep Domnarix under control and prevent him from carrying out his plans. And as, in fact, I saw that he was becoming more reckless and irresponsible every day, it was clearly necessary to take precautions so as to stop him from doing any harm to me personally or to the general interests of Rome. We were delayed at Bologna for about 25 days, because the northwest wind, the prevailing wind in these parts, made it impossible to sail, and during this time I did my best to see to it that Domnarix remained loyal, though at the same time I took steps to find out what his real plans were. In the end, we got the right weather for sailing, and I issued orders for the embarkation of both infantry and cavalry. While everyone's attention was occupied with carrying out these orders, Dunmerix, accompanied by some Aeduan cavalrymen, slipped out of camp without my knowledge, and started to go home. As soon as I was informed of this, I put off sailing, and, leaving everything else aside, sent a strong force of cavalry to capture him. If he resisted or refused to obey, he was to be killed. For I did not imagine that a man who had flouted my authority to my face was likely to behave sensibly when I was not there. In fact, when he was ordered to come back, he attempted to resist and to fight off his pursuers, calling on his followers to help him, and repeatedly shouting out that he was a free man and the citizen of a free country. In accordance with my instructions, he was surrounded and killed. All the Aedui who were with him returned to camp. When this was done, I left Labienus on the continent with 3 legions and 2,000 cavalry. His orders were to guard the ports, to arrange for our food supplies, to keep himself informed about what was going on in Gaul, and, in the event of an emergency, to take whatever measures he thought fit. I myself, with 5 legions and 2,000 cavalry, set sail about sunset. We started with a gentle southwesterly wind, but about midnight the wind dropped. Failing to keep our course, we were carried on too far by the tidal current, and at dawn we saw Britain far away behind us on our left. Once again we followed the turn of the tide, and attempted to row to the part of the island that, as we had discovered the past summer, was the best place for making a landing. The soldiers worked magnificently. Pulling at the oars without stopping, they managed to make the heavily loaded transports keep up with the warships. The whole fleet reached the coast of Britain about midday. Not a single enemy was in sight. In fact, as we found out afterward from prisoners, large enemy forces had assembled there, but had been terrified by the great numbers of our ships, and had withdrawn from the beach and hidden themselves on the higher ground. There must indeed have been more than 800 ships, all visible at once, what with the addition of those that had survived from last year, and various extra ships that had been built by individuals for their own use. The army was disembarked, and a suitable place was chosen for our camp. Then, after we had discovered from prisoners where the enemy's forces had taken up position, I left 10 cohorts and 300 cavalry on the shore to guard the ships, and started out in the direction of the enemy soon after midnight. Quintus Atrius was left in charge of the fleet, and I had no anxiety about its safety, as the ships were lying at anchor on an open shore of soft sand. A night march of about 12 miles brought us in sight of the enemy's forces. They had moved down with their cavalry and chariots from the high ground to a river, and here they attempted to check us by joining battle. They were driven back by our cavalry, but concealed themselves in the woods, where they had an extremely good position, strong in itself and strongly fortified. No doubt it had been made ready previously for some war among themselves, for every entrance to the place was blocked by numbers of trees that had been felled. The Britons themselves came out of the woods to fight in small detachments, and tried to prevent our men from getting inside their fortifications. But the men of the 7th Legion, locking their shields together in tortoise formation, threw up a ramp against the fortifications, took the position, and drove the enemy out of the woods at the cost of only a few wounded. I forbade them to press the pursuit far, both because I was ignorant of the country, and because much of the day had already gone, and I wanted to leave time for entrenching our camp. Next day, early in the morning, I divided the infantry and cavalry into 3 divisions, and sent them out as flying columns to pursue the retreating enemy. They had already gone some way, so that only the rear guards of the column were visible, when some horsemen came from Quintus Atrius with the news that on the previous night a great storm had damaged nearly all the ships and thrown them up on shore. The anchors and cables had failed to hold, and the sailors and steersmen had not been able to do anything in the face of the violence of the storm. So the ships had collided with each other, and very great damage had been done. When I heard this news, I ordered the legions and cavalry to be recalled. If attacked on the road, they were to beat off the attack, but continue marching. I myself returned to the fleet, and saw with my own eyes that the situation was almost exactly as it had been described to me by the messengers and their dispatches. About 40 ships were a total loss, but it seemed that it would be possible to repair the rest, though this would mean much hard work. I therefore picked out from the legions all soldiers who were skilled craftsmen, and sent instructions for others to be brought over from the continent, and I wrote to Labienus asking him to put his troops to work and get as many ships constructed as possible. Meanwhile, I decided that, in spite of the enormous labour involved, the best thing to be done was to have all the ships beached and included within the line of the camp's fortifications. We spent about 10 days in getting this done, the work going on continuously, day and night. Once the ships were beached and the camp really well fortified, I set out for the point from which I had returned, leaving behind the same forces as before to guard the ships. When I reached the position from which we had retired, I found that, in the interval, British forces in greater numbers had come in from all parts of the country. By general consent, the supreme command in war had been given to Casavalonas, a chief whose territory begins about 75 miles inland from the sea, and is separated from the territory of the coastal tribes by a river called the Thames. Previously there had been a continual state of war between Casavalonas and the other tribes, but our arrival had had such an effect on the Britons that they had agreed to appoint him as commander-in-chief. The interior of Britain is inhabited by people who claim, on the strength of their own tradition, to be indigenous to the island. The coastal districts are inhabited by invaders from Belgium, who came originally for the sake of plunder, and then, when the fighting was over, remained and began to live by agriculture. They nearly all bear the names of the states from which they came before they crossed into Britain. The population is very large indeed. Farm buildings, which are very like those of the Gauls, are to be seen everywhere, and there are great numbers of cattle. For money they use either coins of bronze or gold, or iron ingots of a fixed standard of weight. Tin is found in the Midland area, and iron near the coast, but there is not much of it. The bronze that they use is imported. Every sort of timber that one gets in Gaul grows in Britain, except for beech and pine. They think it wrong to eat hares, chickens, or geese, but keep these animals as pets to amuse themselves. The climate is more temperate than in Gaul, and the cold seasons are less severe. Britain is shaped like a triangle. One side faces Gaul, and one corner of this side, where Kent is, points east. It is to this part of the coast that nearly all the ships from Gaul put in. The lower corner of this side points south. The length of this side is about 500 miles. Another side faces westward, toward Spain. In this direction is Ireland, which is estimated to be about half the size of Britain, and is the same distance from Britain as Britain is from Gaul. Halfway between Britain and Ireland is an island called the Isle of Man, and it is thought that there are several other smaller islands too. In these islands, according to some accounts, there is continued night for 30 days at midwinter. On this point we made a number of inquiries, but found out nothing. However, by making accurate measurements with a water clock, we did discover that the nights are shorter than on the continent. The length of this western side of Britain is, according to the opinion of the natives themselves, 700 miles. The third side faces north and has no land opposite it, though the eastern corner looks out roughly toward Germany. This side is supposed to be 800 miles long. Thus the whole island is 2,000 miles in circumference. Much of the most civilized of the Britons are those who live in Kent, a part of the country which is entirely maritime and where the people have a way of life very much like that of the Gauls. Most of the tribes in the interior do not grow grain, but live on milk and meat, and are clothed in skins. All Britons dye their bodies with woad, which gives them a blue colour, and thus produces a terrifying effect when they go into battle. They wear their hair long, and shave every part of the body except the head and upper lip. Wives are shared between groups of 10 or 12 men, particularly between brothers or between fathers and sons. But the children born from these unions are considered to belong to the man to whom the woman was married first. On the march, the enemy cavalry and charioteers fought a fierce engagement with our cavalry, but the result was that our men proved themselves superior in every way, and drove them off into the woods or into the hills. However, we pressed the pursuit too far, and though we killed a number of them, we lost some men ourselves. Then, after an interval, when our men were off their guard and busy on the work of entrenching our camp, the enemy suddenly rushed out of the woods, charged down on the detachment that was on duty in front of the camp, and made a vigorous attack on them. In support I sent up 2 cohorts, the first of their respective legions, which took position quite close to each other. But our men were disconcerted by the unfamiliar tactics with which they were faced, and the enemy, showing great daring, broke through the gap between the cohorts and got away safely. That day one of our senior officers, Quintus Liberius Durus, was killed in action. More cohorts were sent forward, and the enemy were driven back. The action had been fought in front of the camp, with the whole army looking on, and it was clear that in fighting of this kind, our men were at a disadvantage against such an enemy because of the weight of armour which we carried. We could not pursue them when they retired, and we did not dare to go far from the standards. It was clear, too, that things were far from easy for our cavalry, for the enemy often retreated deliberately, and then, when they had drawn our cavalry away from the support of the legions, leaped down from their chariots and started fighting on foot, with all the odds in their favour. Another difficulty was in the fact that they never fought in close order, but always in scattered groups with wide intervals between them. Moreover, they had reserves posted at strategic points, so that one unit could cover another's retreat, and strong fresh troops could relieve those who were tired. Next day the enemy took up a position on hills some distance away from our camp. They only appeared in small parties, and, though they made some assaults on our cavalry, attacked less vigorously than on the day before. But at midnight, when I had sent out 3 legions and all the cavalry under the General Gaius Trebonius to get forage, the enemy suddenly swooped down from all sides on the foragers, and pressed their attack right up to the ranks of the legions, which were in battle order. Our men charged them fiercely, and drove them back. After this the pursuit continued. Our cavalry, seeing the legions behind them and relying on their support, drove the enemy before them in headlong flight, killing great numbers and giving them no chance to rally and make a stand or jump down from their chariots. The immediate effect of this rout was that the additional enemy forces that had come in from all over the country began to disperse, and they never afterwards put their whole army into the field against us. After discovering what the enemy's plans were, I led the army inland to the river Thames on the frontier of Casavalonas' country. There is only one point where the river can be forded, and even here the crossing is a difficult one. I observed when we reached this place that large enemy forces were drawn up ready for battle on the opposite bank. The bank itself was fortified with sharp stakes fixed along it, and as we were informed by prisoners and deserters, other stakes of the same kind had been driven into the bed of the stream and were hidden by the water. I at once ordered the cavalry to go ahead and the legions to follow them. Our soldiers crossed with only their heads above water, but they moved so fast and showed such fighting spirit that the enemy were unable to stand up to the combined attack of our cavalry and infantry. They abandoned their positions on the bank and fled. As already stated, Casavalonas had now given up all idea of fighting a pitched battle. He had disbanded most of his forces, but kept back about 4,000 charioteers. With these he followed closely on our line of march, keeping always a little way off our route, and concealing himself in the woods and thickets. When he had found out in what direction we were going to go, he drove into the woods all the cattle and human beings that were in the fields. Then, whenever our cavalry ranged any distance over the fields to get plunder or lay waste the country, he sent his charioteers from the forests by every available track or path to engage them in battle. Our cavalry were in great danger from these charioteers, and the fear of them prevented us from extending our operations very far. All I could do was to tell the cavalry to keep in contact with the marching column of the legions, which meant that we could only burn and ravage the countryside over an area which could be covered by the strenuous marches of our infantry. In the meantime, a deputation came to me from the Trinobantes, perhaps the strongest state in this part of the country. It was from this state that young Mandubracius had come to Gaul and put himself under my protection. He had had to fly for his life after his father, king of the Trinobantes, had been murdered by Casavalonas. The deputation which now arrived offered the surrender of the tribe and promised to carry out all my orders. They begged me to protect Mandubracius from Casavalonas and to send him back to his own country as supreme ruler. I told them to bring me 40 hostages and a supply of grain for the army, and I sent Mandubracius back to them. My orders were carried out promptly, both the grain and the required number of hostages being delivered. Now that the Trinobantes were taken under Roman protection and preserved from suffering any harm at the hands of our troops, other tribes, the Cenemagni, Sengotiaci, Anchialites, Bibroci, and Cassi, also sent deputations and offered to surrender. I discovered from them that we were now quite near the main stronghold of Casavalonas. It was a position protected by forests and marshes, and considerable numbers of men and cattle had been brought together there. Incidentally, what the Britons describe as a stronghold is any position in a thick forest which they have fortified with a rampart and trench, and which they use as a place of refuge from invading enemy forces. We now started for this stronghold and found that it was extremely well placed and extremely well fortified. Nevertheless, we moved directly against it, attacking it from two sides. There was a brief resistance, but the enemy could not face the vigor of our assault, and rushed out of the place on another side. We found a great quantity of cattle in the stronghold, and many of the enemy were captured or killed while trying to escape. While these operations were going on, Casavalonas sent messengers to Kent, the aforementioned district by the sea, ordering the 4 kings of that part of the country, Cingetorix, Carvilius, Texamagulus, and Segovax, to mobilize all their forces and make a surprise attack on our naval camp. The Kentish army duly appeared in front of our camp, but our men made a sortie, and after killing great numbers of them, and capturing one of their leaders, a man of noble birth called Lugurix, retired again without loss. When he received the news of this engagement, Casavalonas, already disturbed by his many defeats, by the devastation of his country, and particularly by the fact that the tribes were beginning to come over to us, sent a deputation to me to ask for terms of surrender, using Comius the Atrebatian as an intermediary. I had decided to winter on the continent, in view of the danger of sudden uprisings among the Gauls. Not much of the summer was left, and I knew that for this short time the Britons could easily avoid any decisive action. I therefore ordered hostages to be delivered, fixed the tribute to be paid annually by Britain to Rome, and gave strict orders to Casavalonas to avoid doing any harm to Mandubracius or the Trinobantes. As soon as the hostages were delivered, I led the army back to the sea, where we found the ships repaired. After they had been launched, I decided, in view of the large number of prisoners we had, and the fact that some ships had been lost in the storm, to make the return journey in 2 trips. Actually, it so happened that, out of the whole of these great fleets on all their voyages, both in this and in the preceding year, not a single ship with troops aboard was lost, while on the other hand, out of the ships which were sent back to me empty from the continent, that is, those on their way from Gaul after disembarking the first contingent, and the second fleet which had been built under the supervision of Labienus, very few indeed reached their proper destination, nearly all of them being forced back to the point from which they started. I waited some time in vain for these ships. Then, being afraid that the weather might prevent us from sailing at all, since it was nearly the time of the equinox, I had to put more men than I would normally have done aboard the ships I had. The sea then became absolutely calm. We weighed anchor soon after 9 p.m., and reached land quite safely with the whole fleet at dawn on the following day. A revolt in Gaul. Destruction of a Roman army. After we had beached the ships, a council of the Gallic chiefs was held at Amiens. That year there had been a drought in Gaul, and the harvest had been a bad one. I was therefore compelled to adopt different methods from usual in arranging winter quarters for the legions, and to distribute them over a large number of states. One legion under Gaius Fabius was sent to the Morini, another under Quintus Cicero to the Nervi, and a third under Lucius Roscius to the Esubi. A fourth legion, with Titus Labienus in command, was ordered to winter among the Remi on their frontier with the Treveri. 3 more legions were quartered among the Belgi. They were commanded by the quaestor Marcus Crassus, and the generals Lucius Munatius Plancus and Gaius Trebonius. One other legion, which had recently been raised in the country north of the Po, together with 5 extra cohorts, was sent under the command of Quintus Titurius Sabinus and Lucius Aurunculeius Cotta into the country of the Eburones. This tribe, most of whose territory lies between the Meuse and the Rhine, was governed by the chiefs Ambiorix and Catuvolcus. By distributing the legions in this way, I thought that we should most easily be able to meet the difficulties of securing our grain supply. In fact, the winter camps of all the legions, except for the one under Roscius, which had been sent into a perfectly quiet and peaceful area, were within 100 miles of each other. For the time being, I decided to stay in Gaul myself, until I was informed that all the legions had reached their destinations, and had fortified their camps. Among the Carnutes was a man of noble birth called Tasgetius, whose ancestors had been kings of the tribe. He had been most remarkably useful to me in all my campaigns, and in recognition of his great abilities and his loyalty to me, I had restored him to the position once held by his ancestors. He had already been king for more than 2 years, but now, with the open approval of many people among the Carnutes, his enemies assassinated him. I was informed of this crime, and since it appeared that many people were involved in it, I was afraid that they might use their influence to make the whole state revolt. I therefore instructed Lucius Plancus to leave Belgium and proceed at once to the country of the Carnutes. Here he was to spend the winter, and was also to arrest and send to me those whom he found guilty of the murder of Tasgetius. Meanwhile, dispatches reached me from the quaestor, and from all the generals in command of legions. They informed me that they had reached their quarters, and that the winter camps were fortified. About a fortnight later, trouble suddenly began. The originators of the revolt were Ambiorix and Catuvolcus. After coming to meet Sabinus and Cotta on the frontiers of their territory, and bringing supplies of grain to our camp, they had been incited by messages from Indutio Marus of the Treveri to revolt against us. They swept down and overwhelmed a party of our men who were collecting wood, and then came on in large numbers to attack the camp. Our troops quickly armed and mounted the rampart. A detachment of Spanish cavalry was sent out from one of the gates and fought a successful action against the enemy horsemen, and giving up all hopes of success, the enemy withdrew from the attack. Then, as they usually do in such cases, they called out loudly, asking for someone from our side to come out and discuss matters with them. They claimed to have something to say which would be beneficial to both parties, and which would lead to a settlement of all matters in dispute. 2 of our people were sent out to confer with the enemy. Gaius Arpanius, a Roman gentleman who was a personal friend of Sabinus, and a Spaniard called Quintus Junius, who had often previously been employed by me on various missions to Ambiorix. In the speech which he made to these 2, Ambiorix began by acknowledging that he was under a great debt of gratitude to me personally. I had relieved him from the tribute which he had always paid in the past to the neighbouring tribe of the Adjuatuki, and I had restored to him his sons and nephew, who had been sent to the Adjuatuki as hostages, and then been enslaved and kept in chains. As to the attack which had just been made on our camp, he said it had been carried out against his will and against his judgment. He had been forced into it by his fellow tribesmen, over whom he exercised a control which was very strictly limited. Indeed, his people had as much power over him as he had over his people, and the reason why his state had taken up arms was that it could not resist the general movement of the Gauls, which had just taken place. This fact could easily be proved. He was not a person of great importance, and was hardly so ignorant of the real situation as to imagine that his army could defeat the Romans. But what had happened was this. The whole of Gaul had got together and chosen this day for making attacks on every one of the Roman camps, so that one legion could not come to the help of another. It would not have been easy, he said, for one who was a Gaul himself to have refused to act with the others, especially when the object of the whole plan was to recover the national liberty. However, so far as the claims of patriotism were concerned, he had done his duty. What he now wanted to do was to show his consideration for what he owed me in return for my kindness to him. He was bound to Sabinus by ties of hospitality, and, in the name of those ties, he most earnestly begged him to think of his own safety, and of the safety of the troops under his command. A great force of German mercenaries had already crossed the Rhine, and were due to arrive in 2 days. It was for the Romans themselves to decide whether or not it would be advisable to withdraw their troops from the camp before the tribes in the neighbourhood could realize what the position was, and march to the camp either of Cicero, who was 50 miles away, or of Labienus, who was a little farther. One thing, said Ambiorix, he would promise, and would guarantee by oath, and that was that he would give them a safe conduct through his own country. He pointed out that in making this offer he was doing the best thing for his own state by relieving them of the burden of a Roman army, and at the same time was doing something to repay me for the kindness I had shown him. After making this speech, Ambiorix withdrew, and Arpanius and Junius reported what they had been told to the generals, who were much disturbed by the sudden turn which events had taken. It was true that the information just received came from the enemy, but they did not think that it ought to be disregarded. There was one particularly disquieting factor. It scarcely seemed credible that an obscure and insignificant tribe like the Eburones dared to take the initiative in making war on Rome. Ambiorix's message was therefore discussed at a council of war. There was a wide difference of opinion among those present. The view expressed by Cotta and by several of the officers and senior centurions was that nothing should be done in a hurry, and that there was no justification for leaving their winter quarters without an order from me personally. Cotta claimed that, however many Germans might arrive, the fortifications of the camp were strong enough to keep them out. This had been proved by the fact that they had held out extremely well against the original enemy attack, and had inflicted a number of casualties. He pointed out, too, that they were adequately supplied with grain, and that before long help would reach them from the nearest camps, or from some other force which I would send to their relief. Finally, it would be, he said, about the most irresponsible and disgraceful thing possible to take the advice of an enemy on matters of real importance to themselves. Sabinus disagreed. They would be leaving things too late, he insisted, if they waited for larger enemy armies, reinforced by Germans, to concentrate, or if, in the meantime, some disaster overtook the neighbouring Roman camps. They had only a short time in which to make up their minds. In his own view, I had already set out for Italy. Otherwise, the Carnutes would not have decided upon the murder of Tasgetius, nor, if I had been in Gaul, would the Eburones have found the self-confidence to attack our camp. It was not, he said, a question of taking advice from the enemy. He was considering the facts. The Rhine was not far away. The Germans were in an angry and resentful mood as a result of the death of Ariovistus and our victories in past campaigns. The Gauls were burning with indignation at all the insults suffered since they had been brought into subjugation to Rome, and at the loss of their former prestige in war. Finally, how could anyone imagine that Ambiorix could have acted as he had done unless he had been quite sure of what he was doing? Sabinus declared that his own plan was safe either way. If, in fact, there was no serious danger, they would reach the nearest legion in perfect safety. If, on the other hand, the whole of Gaul was in alliance with the Germans, then the only chance of escape was in moving at once. As for Cotta and the others who disagreed, what would be the result of adopting their plan? It might be safe enough for the moment, but it most certainly involved the danger of a long siege and death by starvation. The two opposing views were discussed. Cotta and the senior centurions still objected most strongly to the plan of Sabinus. Then Sabinus raised his voice so that many of the ordinary soldiers could hear him, and shouted out, "Have your own way, then, if you must. You will not find me more frightened of death than the rest of you. But these soldiers of ours will be perfectly aware of what is happening, and, if things go wrong, they will hold you responsible for it. If it were not for you, by the day after tomorrow they would be with their comrades in the nearest camp, ready to fight alongside them, instead of being abandoned and isolated from the rest, to die, either by famine or by the sword." The members of the council rose from their places, gathered round the two generals, and implored them not to endanger everything by disagreeing so violently. "Things will be easy," they said, "whether we go or stay, provided that we all are agreed on what should be done. But if we go on quarrelling, we might as well give up hope." The discussion continued until midnight. Finally, Cotta yielded to the pressure brought to bear on him and gave way. Sabinus's plan was adopted, and orders were issued for the army to leave camp at dawn. That night no one slept. Each man was going through his kit to see what he could carry with him, and how much of his winter equipment he would have to leave behind. They went over every possible argument proving that it was safe to go and dangerous to remain, and so exhausted themselves by staying awake that, in fact, their danger was increased. At dawn, they left camp in a long, straggling column with a great deal of heavy baggage. It appeared as though they were convinced that Ambiorix, who had given them the idea, was not an enemy, but the very best of friends. From the noise and general disturbance of the night, the enemy had gathered that we were going to leave, and had posted 2 ambushes in a good position in the woods, well hidden from observation, about 2 miles away. Here they waited for the Romans to arrive, and when the greater part of our force had descended into a deep ravine, they suddenly appeared at both ends of the column, falling upon the rear guard and trying to prevent the men in front from climbing out of the defile. They were thus engaging us on ground where all the advantages were on their side. At this point, Sabinus, who up to now had had no idea that such a thing could happen, began to grow alarmed. He hurried around, trying to get the troops into position. But even this he did nervously, making it obvious that he had completely lost control of the situation, as usually happens when one is forced to start planning in the middle of an action. Cotter, on the other hand, had thought that something like this might happen on the march, and had therefore been against leaving the camp. Now he did everything possible to save the army, leading and encouraging the men like a good general, and fighting in the line like a good soldier. Finding that the length of the column made it impossible for them to attend to everything personally, and to see what was needed at every point, the generals passed word along the line to abandon the baggage and form up in a circle. Considering the emergency, one cannot say that this was a bad plan. Nevertheless, it had unfortunate results, lowering the morale of our own troops and making the enemy all the more ready to attack, since they thought that we were acting in this way because we were in a panic and had given up hope. Then, too, as was bound to happen, a number of soldiers left the ranks to find and get hold of their most cherished possessions in the baggage train, shouting and cursing their luck as they did so. The natives, on the other hand, acted most intelligently. Their leaders passed the word around among their whole army that no one was to leave the ranks. All the plunder was theirs, and everything left by the Romans was reserved for them alone. Meanwhile, they were told to make up their minds that everything depended on winning the battle. The Gauls showed as much courage and as much ardor as we did, yet our men, let down as they had been by their commander, and with all the luck against them, still relied on their fighting qualities to save them, and whenever one of our cohorts charged forward, great numbers of the enemy fell before it. Ambiorix, seeing what was happening, instructed his men to hurl their weapons at long range, and not to come too close to us. Whenever we charged, they were to give ground. Their light armor and their constant training would enable them to do this without any risk. Then, when our men fell back into line, they were to counterattack. These orders were carefully carried out. Whenever a cohort left the circle and charged, the enemy fell back with the utmost rapidity. Meanwhile, the attacking cohort was of course unprotected on its right flank, and thus exposed to a shower of enemy missiles. And when it began to retire to its original position in the circle, it was practically surrounded, both by those who had fallen back in the first place, and by the nearest enemy units who had remained in their positions. If, on the other hand, our soldiers merely tried to hold their ground in the circle, they had no chance at all of showing their fighting qualities. Huddled closely together, they were an easy target for the weapons hurled at them by that great mass of men. Yet, in spite of all the difficulties, and in spite of very heavy casualties, they still stood firm. Much of the day had gone by. They had been fighting from dawn till 2 p.m., and in all this time they had done nothing unworthy of themselves. In this fighting, Titus Balventius, a gallant soldier most highly respected by everyone, who last year had been chief centurion of his legion, had both thighs transfixed with a javelin. Another centurion of the same rank, Quintus Lucanius, was killed in a most gallant attempt to rescue his own son, who had been surrounded. Cotter himself, while cheering on the cohorts, going from company to company, was wounded by a sling stone which struck him full in the face. Sabinus was alarmed at the way things were going. In the distance he could see Ambiorix urging on his men, and he sent Gnaeus Pompeius, his interpreter, to him to ask for quarter for himself and his troops. In reply to this appeal, Ambiorix said that Sabinus could come and speak to him if he wished. So far as the soldiers were concerned, he hoped that he would be able to persuade his men to spare their lives. In any case, he would personally guarantee that Sabinus himself should come to no harm. Sabinus then went to the wounded Cotta, and proposed that they should both withdraw from the fight and go together to discuss matters with Ambiorix, who, he hoped, might be persuaded to grant them their lives and the lives of their troops. But Cotta said that he was not going to make approaches to any enemy who still carried arms, and nothing would make him change his mind. Sabinus ordered all officers and senior centurions who were with him at the moment to follow him. When he approached Ambiorix, he was told to lay down his arms, which he did, and instructed those who were with him to do also. He then joined in a conversation with Ambiorix about terms. Ambiorix deliberately prolonged the discussion, and Sabinus was gradually surrounded and then killed. The natives at once raised their customary cry of triumph, and, yelling and screaming, charged down upon our army, and broke through the ranks. Cotta fell fighting where he stood, and most of the troops died with him. The remainder retired to the camp from which they had set out. One of them, Lucius Patricidius, the standard-bearer of the legion, found himself surrounded by great crowds of the enemy. He threw the eagle inside the rampart, and himself died, fighting most gallantly outside the camp. The others just managed to keep the enemy out until nightfall. In the night, since there was no hope left, every man of them committed suicide. A few soldiers had managed to slip away while the fighting was going on. By taking roundabout routes through the forests, they succeeded in reaching Labienus's camp, and told him what had happened. The attack on Cicero's camp. Flushed with this success, Ambiorix at once set out with all his cavalry, and riding day and night came to the Aduatuci, a tribe living next to his kingdom. The infantry were ordered to follow. He explained what had been done, and persuaded the Aduatuci to take up arms. Next day he went on to the country of the Nervi, and urged them not to let slip this excellent opportunity of winning freedom for themselves forever, and of making the Romans suffer for all the outrages they had committed. He informed them that 2 Roman generals had been killed, and the greater part of their army annihilated. It would not be difficult, he suggested, to make a sudden attack on the winter camp of Cicero, and to destroy the legion under his command also, and he offered his own assistance in carrying out this enterprise. The Nervi were easily persuaded to cooperate. Messengers were at once sent out to the dependent tribes of the Sutrones, the Grudi, the Levaci, the Plumoxi, and the Gaidumni. The largest possible forces were assembled, and with these they suddenly swooped down on Cicero's camp. Cicero had not yet heard of the death of Sabinus, and it happened to him too, as it was inevitable, that some of his troops, who had gone into the woods to get timber for the fortifications, were cut off by the sudden appearance of the enemy cavalry and surrounded. After this, a huge host of Eburones, Nervi, and Aduatuci, with all their allies and dependents, launched a direct attack on the camp. Our men quickly ran to arms and mounted the rampart. That day they only just managed to hold out, for all the enemy's hopes lay in speed, and they were convinced that if they won the battle here, they would go on winning everywhere else. Cicero wrote to me at once and offered large rewards to anyone who could get through the enemy lines, but all the roads were blocked, and his messengers were intercepted. During the night the men worked with incredible speed. Using the timber that had been brought in for the fortifications, they ran up about 120 towers, and strengthened all apparent weaknesses in the defences. Next day the enemy appeared with much larger forces than before. They assaulted the camp and filled in the ditch. but our men put up the same resistance as on the previous day. And so it went, day after day. There was no breaking off work during the nights, no chance of sleep either for the sick or the wounded. Everything needed to meet the next day's attack had to be got ready during the hours of darkness. Quantities of stakes with their points hardened in the fire, and huge numbers of siege spikes were made. Extra stories were built on the towers, and battlements and breastworks of hurdles were fitted to them. Cicero himself was in very poor health, yet he would not take any rest, even during the night, until the men themselves came crowding around him and insisted that he must look after himself. Some of the chieftains and leaders of the Nervi had been on friendly terms with Cicero, and so had some excuse for approaching him. They now declared that they wished to parley. Their request granted, at this interview they adopted exactly the same line as that followed by Ambiorix when he spoke with Sabinus. The whole of Gaul, they said, was in arms. The Germans had crossed the Rhine. All Roman winter camps, including my own, were under assault. They then informed him of the death of Sabinus, and produced Ambiorix as evidence for the truth of their story. "You are making a great mistake," they said, "if you think you are likely to get any help from the others, when the others are in desperate straits themselves. We ourselves, however, have nothing against Cicero or against Rome, except that we do not like this practice of quartering your armies on us for the winter, and we do not want this to become an established thing. So far as we are concerned, you are free to leave the camp in perfect safety, and march in whatever direction you like without any fear at all." To all this, Cicero had only one reply to make. "Rome," he said, "does not make terms with an enemy who is still bearing arms. If you lay down your arms, I am prepared to give you facilities for sending a deputation to Caesar, and as Caesar is a just man, I trust that he will look favorably on your requests." Disappointed in this direction, the Nervi began to surround our camp with a rampart 9 feet high, and a ditch 15 feet wide. They had learned how to do this by watching us in previous years, and were given further instructions by prisoners from our army whom they had with them, though we did not know this. However, they had none of the proper tools for the work, and had to do their best by cutting the sod with their swords, lifting out the earth with their bare hands, and carrying it away in their cloaks. With this in mind, one can get some idea of their numbers from the fact that in less than 3 hours they completed a line of earthworks 5 miles in circumference. And in the days following, still under the direction of Roman prisoners, they set to work on the construction of towers high enough to command our rampart, together with grappling irons and mantlets. On the 7th day of the siege there was a high wind, and the enemy began slinging red-hot missiles moulded from clay and hurling incendiary darts into the huts, which were thatched with straw after the Gallic fashion. The huts quickly caught fire, and the strong wind spread the flames all over the camp. At this the enemy raised a great shout, as though victory were not only in their grasp, but already won, and began to bring up their siege towers and mantlets, and to scale the rampart with ladders. But our men showed a courage and a presence of mind that were quite remarkable. They were scorched by the fire burning all around them. They were under a constant hail of missiles, and they were aware that all their baggage and all their private possessions were ablaze. Yet not a single man left his post on the rampart, and scarcely one of them even looked over his shoulder. Every man of them at this moment of crisis fought with the utmost gallantry and the utmost resolution. It was much the toughest day's fighting of all, yet in the end the result was that on this day more of the enemy were killed and wounded than on any other, for the Gauls were crowded in a dense mass right underneath our rampart, and those in front had no chance of retiring because of the pressure on them from behind. In one sector, when the fire had died down a little, an enemy tower was brought forward so that it was actually touching the rampart. Whereupon the centurions of the third cohort withdrew from the position they were holding, ordered their men to fall back too, and then made signs and shouted invitations to the Gauls to come in if they liked. But none of them dared to come forward. They were dislodged by volleys of stones from all sides, and their tower was set on fire. In this legion there were two absolutely first-rate soldiers, Titus Pullo and Lucius Vorenus, both centurions who were nearly qualified for the top rank of seniority. These two never stopped arguing about which of them was the better soldier, and every year, when it came to the question of promotions, each one would try to outdo the other. Now, when the fighting round the rampart was at its fiercest, Pullo shouted out, "What are you waiting for, Vorenus? Do you want a better chance of showing how you can fight? Today will settle the argument between us." With these words he went forward, beyond the fortifications, and charged into the enemy at the point where their ranks were the thickest. Vorenus, of course, was not going to stay behind. He knew what people would think of him if he did, and so he went straight off to Pullo. When a little way from the enemy, Pullo hurled his javelin and transfixed one of the Gauls who had run forward to meet him. The Gaul was struck down unconscious, but his comrades covered him with their shields, while from all sides weapons rained down on Pullo so that he had no chance of retiring. One javelin went right through his shield and stuck in his sword belt. This twisted his scabbard out of position, so that when he tried to draw his sword he could not at first seize the hilt. While he was struggling to do so, the enemy surrounded him. But now his rival Vorenus came up and got him out of his difficulties. Thinking that Pullo had been killed by the spear, the Gauls all turned away from him and immediately set upon Vorenus, who, fighting with his sword at close quarters, killed one man and was beginning to drive the others back. But in pressing forward too eagerly, he stumbled and fell into a depression in the ground. Now it was his turn to be surrounded, and the turn of Pullo to come up and rescue him. After killing a few more of the enemy, both centurions came back together safe and sound to the shelter of the fortifications. Each of them had deserved the highest possible praise, and in this bitter rivalry of theirs, fortune had produced a situation in which each of the two enemies had been the friend and saviour of the other, so that it was quite impossible to decide which should be considered the better or the braver soldier. The difficulties and dangers of the siege were becoming greater every day, particularly because so many men were suffering from their wounds that only a few were left to carry on the defence. And as matters got worse, Cicero sent more and more messengers to me with dispatches. Some of these were captured and put to death by torture under the eyes of our troops. But there was a Nervian in the camp, a man of good family called Vertico, who had deserted to Cicero at the very beginning of the siege, and had served him loyally ever since. This man, by offering one of his slaves his freedom, and great rewards as well, persuaded him to carry a dispatch to me. The slave tied the dispatch round his spear shaft, and being a Gaul himself, passed through the Gallic lines without arousing any suspicion. He went on until he came to me, and it was from him I heard of the danger that threatened Cicero and his legion. I received the dispatch in the early evening, and at once sent a messenger to the quaestor, Marcus Crassus, who was in camp about 24 miles away in the country of the Bellovaci, ordering him to start at midnight with his legion and join me as quickly as he could. Crassus left as soon as he received the message. I sent another messenger to Gaius Fabius, telling him to march with his legion into the country of the Atrebates, through which I knew I would have to go myself. I wrote to Labienus, asking him to come with his legion to the Nervian frontier, if he thought that he could do so without undue risk. The rest of the legions were too far away, and I thought it would be wrong to wait for them. But I collected about 400 cavalrymen from the nearest camps. About 9 o'clock on the following morning, I was informed by Crassus's patrols that he was approaching, and I set out myself. We covered about 20 miles that day. I left Crassus with his one legion in command at Amiens, where I had left all the heavy equipment of the army, the native hostages, all my official papers, and all the grain that had been collected to last for the winter. Fabius, who had made reasonable speed, joined me with his legion on the march, as he had been instructed to do. Labienus had heard of the death of Sabinus and the slaughter of his army, but he was now faced with a general mobilization of the Treveri. He was afraid that if he set out from his camp it would look as though he were running away, and he might not be strong enough to beat off an enemy attack, especially as the enemy were now, he knew, in a most confident mood because of their recent victory. He therefore wrote to me to explain the dangers that would be involved in leading his legion out of camp. He also gave me a full account of what had happened in the country of the Eburones, and told me that the whole army of the Treveri, both horse and foot, had taken up a position about 3 miles away from his camp. I was now reduced to 2 legions, instead of the 3 which I had expected, but I approved of the decision which Labienus had made. I considered that our only hope of saving the situation was to act quickly. So we came, by forced marches, to the Nervian frontier, where I found out from prisoners how things were going at Cicero's camp, and how extremely dangerous his position was. By offering a very large reward, I induced one of my Gallic cavalrymen to carry a letter to Cicero. I wrote the letter in Greek, so that if it was intercepted, the enemy would not know what our plans were. I told the messenger that if he could not get near enough to deliver the letter by hand, he was to fasten it to the thong of his spear and throw the spear inside the rampart. In the letter I wrote that I had set out with the legions and would soon be there. I told Cicero to keep his courage up and be of good heart. The Gaul was afraid to approach too near, and threw the spear, as he had been instructed. It happened to stick fast in the woodwork of one of the towers, and there remained unnoticed for 2 days. On the 3rd day, one of our soldiers saw it, drew it out, and brought it to Cicero. After reading it himself, Cicero had the troops drawn up on parade and read it aloud to them. They were overwhelmed with joy. Soon, in the distance, they could see the smoke rising from the villages which we were burning on our way, and this dispelled all doubt about the fact that the legions were coming. When the Gauls received news of our approach through their patrols, they raised the siege and marched against me with their entire force, which amounted to about 60,000 men. Cicero took the opportunity to write to me, again asking Vertico for the use of a Gallic slave to carry the letter. In this letter he advised me to proceed with the utmost caution, and described how the enemy had left his camp and were now in full force marching in my direction. Cicero's letter was delivered to me about midnight. I informed the troops of its contents, and told them to make ready for battle, and to be in good heart. We struck camp at dawn next day, and after advancing about 4 miles, came in sight of the great host of the enemy on the far side of a valley, through which ran a stream. With the small force at my disposal, it would have been very risky indeed to fight on unfavourable ground. Moreover, I knew that Cicero was no longer besieged. There was, therefore, no reason for anxiety, and I could afford to take my time. So we halted and began to fortify a camp, choosing the best position for it that could be found. This camp would in any case have been a small one, since I had a bare 7,000 troops with me, and no baggage at all. But I had it made even smaller still by limiting the width of the camp roadways, my idea being to make the enemy regard us as a contemptible little army. Meanwhile, I sent out scouts in all directions to find out the best route for crossing the valley. That day there were a few minor cavalry engagements near the stream, but the 2 main armies stayed where they were. The Gauls were waiting for reinforcements, which had not yet arrived, and I was hoping, by making it look as though we were afraid, to draw the Gauls onto our own ground and induce them to fight on our side of the valley in front of the camp. If I failed to do this, then in any case the routes would have been explored so that we could cross the valley and the stream with the minimum of risk. Next day at dawn the enemy cavalry rode up to our camp and engaged our own cavalry. In accordance with the plan that I had made, I ordered our men to fall back and retire inside the camp. At the same time, I had the rampart built up higher all around, and the gates barricaded. My instructions were that these operations were to be carried out with a lot of running hither and thither, and as good a show of panic as could be put on. All this had the desired effect of inducing the enemy to bring their forces across the stream, and to draw them up on unfavourable ground. Our troops, meanwhile, had been withdrawn even from the rampart. The enemy came nearer still. They began to hurl missiles from all sides into our fortifications, and they sent heralds all around the circuit of the camp to proclaim that anyone, whether Gaul or Roman, was free to come over to their side, if he did so before 9 a.m. After that there would be no chance. In fact, they showed a quite extraordinary contempt for us. They thought that they could not break into the camp by the gates, which appeared to be barricaded, though in fact they were only screened by single rows of sod. But they started to tear down the rampart with their bare hands, while others of them were busy filling in the ditch. At this point I ordered the legions to sally out from each one of the gates, and at the same time instructed the cavalry to charge. In a moment the enemy were routed so thoroughly that not a man of them stood his ground to fight. We killed great numbers, and those who were not killed threw away their arms. But I was afraid to press the pursuit very far, since there were woods and marshes in the way, and I saw too that there was not much room for doing the enemy more harm than had been done already. Our men had suffered no casualties at all, and on this same day we went and joined Cicero. I was amazed at the sight of the towers which the enemy had erected, and the shelters and siege works generally. When the legion was paraded, I found that less than 1/10 of the men remained unwounded. From all this I could very well see how great the danger had been, and how courageously it had been met. I gave Cicero the high praise that was his due, and congratulated the whole legion as well. I also spoke personally with those officers and centurions whom I discovered from Cicero's accounts to have shown exceptional courage and ability. From the prisoners I received a full account of the fate of Sabinus and Cotta, and next day I held an assembly of the soldiers, explained to them what had happened, and reassured them about the future. They ought not, I said, to take this disaster too much to heart. It had come about simply through the criminal incompetence of a general. Now Providence and their own courage had restored the situation. The enemy's triumph had been short-lived, so I suggested should be their own feelings of despondency. Further revolts. The news of my victory was brought to Labienus by the Remi with incredible speed. Labienus was encamped more than 55 miles away from Cicero, whom I had not reached until about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and yet before midnight there was a noise of shouting outside his gates. It was a party of Remi who had come to announce my victory and offer him their congratulations. The news soon reached the Treveri, and Indutio Maurus, who had decided to make an assault on Labienus's camp next day, fled away in the night and withdrew all his forces into his own country. After sending Fabius and his legion back to their winter camp, I decided to spend the winter myself with 3 legions in 3 separate camps in the neighborhood of Amiens. In view of the serious disturbances that had broken out in Gaul, I came to the conclusion that I should stay with the army myself all through the winter. For as the news spread of the disaster in which Sabinus had been killed, practically all the states in Gaul were beginning to think of war. They kept on sending messengers and embassies all over the country, finding out what the others were planning to do, inquiring who would take the initiative in opening hostilities, and holding meetings by night in out-of-the-way places. All through this winter there was scarcely a moment when I was free from anxiety, and practically every day I received some report or other about plans for a general rising. Among these was a report from Lucius Roscius, whom I had put in command of the 13th Legion. He informed me that large forces of Gauls from the states called Armoricum had assembled to attack him, and had taken up a position within 8 miles of his camp. But when they had heard the news of my victory, they had gone away again, so quickly that they seemed to be running rather than retiring. I summoned the chiefs of each state to my headquarters, and, partly by frightening them with declaring that I knew what was going on, partly by using methods of persuasion, succeeded in keeping most of Gaul loyal. However, the state council of the Senones, a particularly strong and influential people, attempted to put to death their king, Cavarinus, whom I had appointed to the throne. His brother, Mauretascus, had been king at the time I arrived in Gaul, and his ancestors had held the kingship before that. Having information of the plot, Cavarinus escaped, but they pursued him as far as the frontier, then deprived him of the kingship, and declared him an exile. They had sent a deputation to me to justify what they had done, but when I had demanded that the whole of their council should appear before me, they had failed to obey. A tremendous impression had been made on these natives by the fact that someone had been found to take the first step in opening hostilities against us, and the result was such a complete change in the general attitude that there was scarcely a tribe in Gaul that we did not suspect of planning a revolt, except the Aedui and Remi, whom I had always treated with particular distinction. The Aedui because of their long-standing record of unvarying loyalty to us, the Remi because of the help they had given recently in the Gallic campaigns. That such should have been the situation is not, I think, altogether surprising. Apart from many other reasons, one must consider the very deep resentment felt by peoples who used to be regarded as the best and most courageous warriors in the world, but now, through having to take their orders from Rome, found that this reputation was either going or gone. All through the winter, Indutio Maurus and the Treveri never stopped working against us. They were constantly sending embassies across the Rhine in their efforts to gain the support of various German tribes, whom they promised money and assured that all but a small portion of our army had already been wiped out. However, they failed to persuade any German state to cross the Rhine. The Germans pointed out that they had made the experiment twice already, in the campaign under Ariovistus and when the Tencteri crossed the river, and they were not going to tempt fortune for the third time. Though disappointed in his hopes of German aid, Indutio Maurus still went on with his preparations, raising and training troops, buying up horses from neighbouring tribes, and attracting to himself, by means of lavish offers of pay, exiles and criminals from all over Gaul. In this way he had acquired such prestige in Gaul that deputations began to reach him from all parts of the country. Both states and individuals sought for his favour and protection. So, finding that people were coming over to him of their own accord, and observing that in one direction there were the Senones and Carnutes, both ready for revolt because of their guilty consciences, and in another the Nervi and Aduatuci, who were getting ready to attack the Romans, Indutio Maurus came to the conclusion that he would have plenty of volunteers to join him if he advanced beyond his own frontiers. He therefore gave notice of an armed convention, the usual procedure followed by the Gauls at the beginning of a war. A law common to all tribes alike requires all men of military age to come to the assembly armed. The one who arrives last is put to death with every kind of torture before the assembled host. At this convention, Indutio Maurus declared his son-in-law, Cingetorix, a public enemy, and confiscated his property. Cingetorix was a leader of the opposition party, and, as already mentioned, he had put himself under my protection, and had remained loyal to me. After having settled that matter, Indutio Maurus announced to the assembly that he had been summoned by the Senones, the Carnutes, and several other Gallic tribes, and proposed to march to them through the country of the Remi, laying it waste, but before doing this he would attack Labienus's camp. He then gave instructions as to what measures he wished taken. Labienus was safe in a camp which was in a strong natural position, and had been thoroughly well fortified. He felt no anxiety for himself or for his men. His only concern was not to lose any chance of winning a victory. So, after he had heard from Cingetorix and his relations what Indutio Maurus had said at the assembly, he sent out messengers to the neighbouring states in all directions, and ordered cavalry contingents to be sent to him by a certain day. Meanwhile, almost every day Indutio Maurus, with his entire force of cavalry, would ride up close to the Roman camp, sometimes to reconnoitre the position, sometimes to attempt to parley with or intimidate the soldiers, and usually every cavalryman would hurl a weapon inside the rampart. Labienus kept his men well within the fortifications, and did all he could to make the enemy more and more certain that he was afraid of them. As the days went by, Indutio Maurus showed more and more contempt for us on his excursions to the camp. But on one single night Labienus brought inside the fortifications all the cavalry which he had summoned from the neighbouring tribes. By a careful disposition of guards, he prevented anyone from leaving camp, so that there was no possibility of anyone giving away the news, or of the Treveri finding out about it. Indutio Maurus rode up to the camp as usual, and spent most of the day there. His cavalrymen hurled their weapons and used a good deal of insulting language as they challenged our men to come out and fight, but they got no reply from us. Toward evening, when they felt like it, they began to move away in scattered groups and in loose order. Suddenly, Labienus opened 2 of the gates and sent out his whole force of cavalry. He had given them strict orders that, as soon as the enemy panicked, as he knew they would, and were in full flight, every one was to go after Indutio Maurus, and Indutio Maurus alone. They were not to strike a blow at anyone else until they saw him killed. If they delayed over the rest, Indutio Maurus might get a chance to escape. Labienus offered large rewards to whoever succeeded in killing him, and sent out some infantry cohorts to support the cavalry. Fortune favoured the plan that Labienus had made. With everyone after him, Indutio Maurus was caught and killed, just as he was fording the river. His head was brought back to camp. On their return, the cavalry chased and killed as many of the enemy as they could. The forces of Eburones and of the Nervi, which had already assembled, dispersed when they heard the news, and after this action I found that things in Gaul were somewhat quieter.